Okay. Morning, good morning, good morning.
Good morning, Janice. How are you?
I'm fine,
Thank you
thank you.
so
How are
much
you?
for allowing me to be in live with you today. I'd like to welcome everyone who's with us in the group for Jenice Diabetic Solution. I'd like to start off with introducing, if you can introduce yourself, and we're going to talk about your case. But before that, I'd like to talk about what was the reason for me to do this interview. The reason for me to do this interview is I am pre-diabetic, and my sister just recently, a month ago, became diabetic, and she's still in the shock phase, and I needed help. And then I reached to you, and I asked you if I can interview you and ask you all these questions that is needed, and I didn't understand the condition. And now, of course, you said yes, as usual, and I was so happy with that. So why don't you introduce yourself, Janice?
Thank you for that introduction, Mona. First of all, I was very surprised that you reached out because I'm usually on the other side of the microphone and on the other side of the interview table, right? But this was an opportunity for me to be able to answer some questions live for you and people that are experiencing diabetes like you, either with a family member or with themselves, or a friend that they know. So before I get into the whole situation about myself, I just wanted to kind of give you a quick introduction of who I am, and then just give you some contact information up front so that if you need to get a hold of me after the live, then you can. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but I just wanted to kind of let you know that my name is Jenice Walters, and I started to or decided to start the type 2 diabetes, Jenisys Solutions type 2 diabetes group and movement because I am a long-term type 2 diabetic. And so I wanted to just, and I've overcome some things. So I wanted to be able to share that message with everybody in my community. I'm also an author, written a recipe book for type 2 diabetics and for people that are overall wanting to get healthy solutions to meal planning and eating. And then also I am a trainer and technical trainer, as well as a motivational coach. And I've also managed a diabetic type 2 diabetes group, Jenisys Solutions type 2 diabetes. But I'm just going to go ahead and, since that's a lot of information, share my screen and see if I can at least show you the contact information just in case you want to write that down. So I'm going to do that right now.
Okay, so you have a Facebook group, you have your cookbook,
Yes,
and you are going to start your own live podcast, right?
yes. Can you
In
see the
January.
screen? Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen.
Okay, so in terms of the information, then you can see that I have the information here. I'm just going to leave it up for a few seconds as we talk, but this is the information that you can reach me either on Instagram at jenice.walters. You can also reach me at Jenisys Alternative Recipes type 2 diabetic if you wanted to kind of take a look at the recipe book. The other group is my diabetes group, Jenisys Solutions Type 2 Diabetes, and that's the information to find that on Facebook. And then I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about my upcoming podcast, which is going to be the new thing in January of 2022. I will be starting a podcast in terms of the diabetes and having some live guests on as well. And that will be upcoming in January 2021. So stay tuned for that. I'll be giving more information as that gets closer to the time. And then I also just wanted to remind you of the live sessions that I do each Monday at this time. And I normally have guests who come on to talk about their challenges, their wins, their struggles with type 2 diabetes, whether it be themselves or whether it be a family member, and how they deal with the diagnosis, if they're newly diagnosed, and how they deal with all of those emotional things that they go through as a newly diagnosed diabetic. And then also at 8:30 in the morning, I do have a live session with my colleague, Lois Garner, from As We Go, and she is from the epileptic seizure community. And we have, it's a very interesting story. If you go to my page, you should be able to locate our story and how we actually met and how we came together to collaborate. Very, very interesting story, very powerful story, and divine intervention happening for that story. So go ahead and check that out. But we have live musings, Monday musings on Monday morning at 8:30 Central Time, 9:30 Eastern Time. And we talk about different topics that we amongst ourselves discuss, and we find that it's very interesting to bring to our respective audiences. So that's my information. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen at this point, but I will pull it up later on at the end so you can get the information if you didn't get it right away. So I'm back.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So my first question is regarding myself, and that is when the doctor told me I am pre-diabetic, I was so shocked, but I didn't still understand it. He still told me to change some stuff, but he didn't explain to me exactly what to change. Then suddenly my sister became diabetic, and she was before pre-diabetic. So in which level can the condition changes? Is it going to be like if your sugar level is more than 400, or is how can I help myself that I don't reach that? How can
Okay.
I stop becoming pre-diabetic or reach diabetic stage?
Okay, so there's two ways that diabetes is measured. The A1C, which is an overall over like a 3-month span of an average of what your sugars normally run during that 3-month span, an average. So the A1C is a very good indicator of what your sugars normally run. The
Okay.
glucose level is what you will take when you take a blood sample, and they test your blood for sugar amounts or sugar levels in the blood at that particular time in real time. So there's two ways, an average of what it was over the last 3 months and what it is right there and then as they take that blood sample with the glucometer or the glucose machine. They can tell right then and there how high your sugar is right at that moment. So I'm not a doctor, but I will say that when I was pre-diabetic, my A1C was it was about 11 or 12 at the time, which meant that my sugars on an average were running well over 400, which is totally out of control. They were very surprised that I was still walking around without some more severe types of symptoms showing or coming up. The other thing was my sugar was well over 300 on that particular day when I had the blood test in the doctor's office. So, but before that, when I was pre-diabetic, it was lower. It was like around 6 or about 6 something. So it was pre-diabetic and getting ready to turn into diabetes, but I didn't really manage it immediately. So when I was told I was pre-diabetic, I thought that I had some time, and I thought that, well, I don't have it yet. So I kind of lulled myself into a false sense of protection, where I don't have it yet, so I've got some time. I don't, it's not really serious yet because I don't actually have it, so I'm okay. And so I kind of lulled myself into a false sense of security, and so continued basically doing what I was doing. So the bottom line is it was pre-diabetic, and then I didn't really manage it, and then it manifested into full-blown diabetes. And by the time it did, it was way over. It was in the 400s and 300s, 400s, and then my A1C was 11 and 12, which is very, very high. Normal is considered in the 5s. That's normal ranges.
Okay.
So when you talk about 11 and 12 and 8 and 7 and 9, That's now
That's
diabetic. Yeah.
okay. Okay.
All right.
So getting back to my sister, that when she went into the hospital and the doctors discovered that she was diabetic, she couldn't believe it. She went into spiral of negative thoughts, like she was denying it first. Then when she went into the hospital, she couldn't even focus. She was crying all the time, and she was saying, my life is finished and all that. So how can you stop those negative thoughts? How can I help her stop all these negative thoughts?
Well, I think
That's
what causes those negative thoughts initially, at least for me, let's talk about from my perspective, because I can only really talk about my perspective because it happens differently for everybody. Everybody that's been newly diagnosed,
true.
everyone that has diagnosis of diabetes, they internalize it or externalize it or come to grips with it in different ways. So I'm going to talk about it from my perspective. And because I've been in the mental health community and doing counseling and have a little idea about human behavior and a little idea about human thought and how they perceive things and how they behave based on the things that they perceive or believe, I can talk from that perspective. So from my perspective, I was in denial. First of all, when I was told I was pre-diabetic, I didn't have it. But the bottom line is I should have really taken it seriously then, that I will continue, that I will become diabetic if I continue the way that I was going. So I was in denial and kind of felt, I heard the news and I heard it, but I didn't take it in. I didn't internalize it and make it seem like I had it right then, or I would have it eventually if I didn't change my behavior. So I kind of dismissed it, basically. When
Mm,
I was now forced to deal with the fact that now I had it, I was angry. The first initial feeling was anger, because I was like, this is something you could have avoided. You didn't. You didn't take it seriously. You kept doing what you were supposed to do, even though you said you were going to make changes. You didn't. So I beat myself up, basically, mentally.
yeah. Mm,
And then I figured I was now in despair after the initial anger and the initial despair of, oh, I've got to give up this now. I've got to give up that now. I can't eat this. I can't do that. I'm now doomed to a life of doom with food. And I enjoyed food. That was one of the things that I really enjoyed in my life, was food with friends, and gatherings around meal times and celebrating events and birthdays and holidays. It was always spent around family, friends, people that I cared about, and food. Food was always the central
mm,
piece of that. So now that made me feel like I was not going to be able to enjoy my life anymore. I was not going to be able to socialize with my friends and family the way I had in the past. I was now designated to a life of boring eating, not being able to eat what my friends and my family were eating, not being able to engage the way that I've engaged in the past. And I was angry at that. And I was also in despair because I figured that I had brought on myself. I had brought that on myself, and now I am doomed to live a different way that I'm not going to enjoy, that's not going to be fun. I will not be able to engage with my friends and family. And so it was a double emotional battle that I was going through. And then I still didn't want to deal with it because it was overwhelmed. It was too much. I had to change too much. I had to think differently about food. I had to now shop differently. I had to cook differently. I had to watch what I was eating more closely. And so for me, everything hitting me with the high sugars, and then the doctor telling me at the same time that he was going to put me on the insulin needle, which I mean, all of it was just overwhelmed, because with needles, I'm deathly afraid of needles. Even when I had to go to the dentist to get a numbing shot with a needle in my mouth, I would tense up. The doctor, would have to, I remember one time the doctor had me come back for the appointment because he couldn't give me the needle. I wouldn't allow him to give me the needle. I was that nervous about getting a
mm,
numbing shot to do, a filling. And so I actually got an appointment with a doctor after that to be put to sleep to do the filling because I was so afraid of
ooh,
needles. So
Of course.
that's how deathly afraid of needles I was. So when the doctor told me I was going to have to go on the insulin needle, I had to change what I was doing. All of this was an overwhelming sense of, oh my gosh, where do I begin? Where do I start? I brought this on myself. This is not good. I can't enjoy my life anymore. So it was an overwhelming feeling of all of those emotions. And so when you have an overwhelm, then you tend not to act. When you
That's
have, if you're a different type of person, like I know some people get news, right? Bad news. Once they get the bad news, they're like, okay, this is bad, but what do you do now? They now start to think about the resolution. They start to think about, okay, I've got this thing. How do I deal with it? How do I move forward? My whole thing was, oh my
mm,
gosh, I'm overwhelmed. I've got so many things I got to change. I can't do this. I can't do that. And I just did nothing. So basically, it perpetuated for a while before I finally took it seriously. And what finally changed for me was when I was faced with some serious medical challenges, and it woke me up, because I realized if I continued in that mindset, if I continued in the non taking care of, or just not taking it in stride, and noticing that I do need to make some changes, that I would end up in a very, very bad place. And I didn't want to end up
what
there.
what if the person doesn't listen? If like as a family member, I usually tell her like these things you
Okay.
need to change. She's not
Okay.
listening, and she's not changing. She's like my sister is on the needle and she's
Okay.
taking it 3 times a day,
Uh-huh.
and she's still eating the she cut everything for 2 weeks, then she went back
Ah.
to the normal food.
So
and
here's the thing.
and I don't know how can I support her in that. How can I tell her? Like sometimes I talk to her and she's not listening. She's angry. You're ruining my life. All these things, all these negative words coming in, and I'm there
Okay.
to support her.
Okay. So let me address that. So there's several things that you might need to hear. We are always, with a family member, especially somebody that's close, or a friend, or a partner, our first response is to try and help them and telling them what to do. However, ultimately, the responsibility falls on that person.
True.
Sometimes with people, so listen to me. So sometimes with people, when you try to tell them what to do, it drives them further away from what you want them to do, because they're not ready to hear it yet, or they're not ready to
Mm,
accept it yet, or they're not ready
mm,
to come to terms with it yet. So the more you talk to them about it, the further and further away you're going to drive them, because now they haven't accepted it yet on their level. Ultimately, the responsibility falls on them. Now, hopefully, she will be able to come to terms with it before it manifests into some serious complications. The only thing you can do is to talk to them. The only thing you can do is to give them the information, but ultimately the decision to change has to come from them. And so with you wanting her to change, willing her to change, forcing her to change, maybe not the approach, because she hasn't
mm.
come to terms with it yet. Until the person realizes that they have a problem, as far as they're concerned, there is no problem, right?
Yeah.
So they have to come to terms with the seriousness of their illness. As long as you
Mm,
give them the information, you might give them, the statistics or the information about people that have had diabetes that don't manage it and what happens. Give her that, and then she has the information, because then she's going to be more informed, right? But for you to try and speak to her, talk to her, and she's not listening, or she's telling you that you're ruining her life, she hasn't come to terms with it herself yet. She hasn't
mm,
accepted the fact that her life is now going to be different. I'm hoping and praying for you and her that she comes to that realization before she has manifestations of some serious complications, because there will be coming if she doesn't change. That is the next step. So
yeah.
here's what happens
Yeah.
with diabetes. When you don't manage it and the sugars are consistently high, and they're consistently at levels that they need not to be, and the sugar remains in the blood where it doesn't need to be, then what happens? It then starts to attack your body. It attacks your
Yes.
vital organs. It attacks your eyes, blurry vision. Sometimes you can lose your sight and become blind. It attacks places like your liver. You may go on
Wow.
dialysis because your liver shuts down and your kidneys shut down. It
Mm,
attacks your extremities. You may, lose feeling in your fingers and your toes and your feet. This is why they say that diabetics need to monitor their feet and monitor their bodies and changes in their body very, very strictly, because you just don't know. If you happen to walk around the house barefoot and you step on a nail or you step on a tack and you don't feel it, and that is now in your foot for weeks, months before you notice there's a problem with infection or whatever, you don't even realize that you have an infection because you've lost the feeling in your feet. People have ended up losing their feet, losing their legs, losing their arms,
yeah.
losing extremities because they weren't aware that the diabetes high levels was causing issues in their body. So you can only give her but so much information, and then she needs to be able to make the decision on her own, because ultimately, whatever happens, she's responsible for her health, her own health.
Yeah.
You
So
can't
true.
you can't give your health to her. She has to take control of her health.
That's
And
true.
until she's ready
That's
to
true.
accept it, that's unfortunately.
She's still not ready. We're having all these arguments. Then this week I stopped. So for me to understand what's happening to her, I was researching um, how can you change your lifestyle. I still didn't understand for a diabetic person to how can they change their lifestyle. What are the steps? Is it
Okay.
uh, do you cut the sugar suddenly or gradually, or what else can you change?
Well, again, it's different for different people, because um, diabetes is caused by the pancreas not either producing enough insulin to break down the food that you eat, to change it into fuel, to take it into the cells of the body for fuel, or not making any at all. So it makes different people have different levels of insulin that's produced. And for the most part, in a diabetic, it's not enough to break down the food. So what happens to that extra sugar? It stays in the blood. So depending on how high your sugars are, depending on what the levels are overall in an average, and let's say your A1C, and depending on what it is that you normally eat, all of those things are factors that will determine what you need to do. If they're really, really high, what they tend to do in the medical industry is to get those sugars down immediately. So they tell you to cut the sugar, to cut the white flour, to cut the bread, to cut all the processed food, because they're so high that if they continue to be high for any length of time, that's going to cause serious complications. But what I
Mhm.
say with change, depending on who the person is and what their parameters are and what their different things that go into what makes up their illness, I think change is more effective when you take it step by step. So for instance, in my case, I had to stop eating sweets because I love sweets. Now, a lot of diabetics don't have a sweet tooth. They have more of a savory tooth. They like more salt and they like more savory food, where they don't have a sweet tooth. Now, I had a sweet tooth. And for a diabetic, that's a double whammy. Sugar on
Mm.
top of sugar is not good. So for me, I had to basically stop eating the sweets and the baked goods and the donuts and the cake and the cookies. So that was an immediate thing that I had to do. The second thing was I didn't drink enough water. So it's a simple thing. Water for most people they can drink more water. I drank everything else but water. So I had to learn to drink water and to like water. And I realized that with water, it sometimes will dilute the concentration of the sugar in my body, especially if it was high. It would help to bring it down if I walked or if I drank a lot of water. So for different people, it's different. They may need to start walking 10 minutes
Yeah.
a day, or they may need to, because they know they eat a lot of carbohydrates, rice, bread, pasta, any of
Mhm.
those kinds of things, that they may need to cut those things down or cut them out completely for a while until we can kind of establish what their baselines are in terms of what are their trigger foods. And I can talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about how you determine that. And when I coach folks, that's what I tell them: how to establish their baselines in terms of their sugar. What are their trigger foods, determining what their trigger foods are, and then creating a plan of action to take based on some of those things. What are their sugars in the morning? What is it after 2 hours after they eat? What are they actually eating? And what is their average over the 3-month span? And then they can quickly see what their trigger foods are and what they need to eat less of, or what they need to cut completely. You can actually tell when you track it. Okay, so those are the things that we discuss in a coaching session with someone who's diabetic or someone who's newly diagnosed, how they move forward with a plan of action.
Okay, so the question is that is more important for me is if someone was working at, you know, their work and they had a very low sugar,
Uh-huh.
what is this the immediate thing that they have to do in order for them to make their sugar normal? And what
Go.
are
Okay,
the symptoms and signs?
that's a good question. So when you are going into low glycemic condition, when it's really too low, and you start to, your body does go through some changes. It's very similar to when it's very, very high too sometimes. So in my case, when it was high and also when it was low, I would get shaky. I would get very shaky. I would start to sweat profusely. I would get a little bit of dizzy, so I'd have to sit down. I'd very unsteady on my feet. So that, and you get the shakes. So it's some similar symptoms when it's really high, and some similar symptoms when it's really low. But usually with the low one, my fingertips would also get cold for some reason. So I would notice that my fingertips were cold, and then my heart would be, when it's high, my heart rate is speeded up. When it's low, it's not as high, but I could feel a difference in my body. So you can actually tell. So the best thing to do when you're not sure, especially as a newly diagnosed diabetic, is to take your sugar and find out what it is, because you're diabetic, right? Take your sugar, see what it is. If it's really high, then you know exactly what's going on. If it's really, really low, below 100, like 60 or 70 or 50, then you know it's too low. So the first thing you need to do if it's too low is to either have a piece of candy or drink a little bit of orange juice, maybe even a regular soda. You don't have to drink the whole thing, just drink a little bit. And within 10 to 15 minutes, you check your sugar again. And that should raise your sugar level. When it's too high, one of the first things you can do is to drink water. Simple thing, to drink water. Make sure you've taken your medication, number 2. And then also to make sure that you get in touch with your doctor, especially if it's really, really high, because it may be at dangerous levels where you may be bordering on stroke, which is what happened to me twice. I was at work and it was so high. I started to sweat. I started to get dizzy. I was very unsteady on my feet. They sat me down and said, well, we're going to send you home. But someone said, no, but she's diabetic. One of my coworkers knew I was diabetic. They says, well, let's find out what her sugar is. And they tested my sugar and it was through the roof. So they called an ambulance and I had to go to the hospital in an ambulance because it was that high. When I got to the hospital, what they said was that my sugar was so high, they were so surprised that I was walking around and didn't have a stroke. I was at stroke level with my sugar. So this is why it's so important to, as a diabetic, as a newly diagnosed diabetic, that you need to understand what your baselines are, what your sugars are when they're high, what they are when they're low, what they need to be when they're normal. Not having that information can put you in a very, very bad situation where it's dangerous for you. Where in my case, it was so high, I was at stroke level. If I was at home, for instance, and I just thought, let me just go down and lie down, maybe, I'll be okay if I lie down and get some rest, I could have had a stroke. So when they put me in the hospital, they put me on fluids immediately. I had IVs immediately to make that concentration go less, and put insulin in my IV to make sure that the sugar was now coming down. And they would not discharge me until that sugar was down to where they felt it was safe enough to send me home. That's how high it was. So rather than having to go through those episodes, and rather than having to have money spent on medical care that you definitely don't need to have if you control it right, it's good to be on top of what's going on with you and your body, taking your sugars when you need to, understanding what happens when you don't, understanding what happens when you eat certain things, understanding what the symptoms are when it's low and when it's high. Being able to have a clear picture of all of those things is going to put you in a better position as a type 2 diabetic, right? So
Okay.
one of the first things, as you said, or as in response to your question, when it's low, a piece of candy, you know, a little bit of soda or a little bit of orange juice or lemon juice, apple juice. And then you take
Okay.
the sugar again. And when it's going up, then you realize, okay, that it's working, right? Making
It's
sure that the
working.
medication was taken, that they took their medication. And then also, if it's really high, on the other opposite end of the spectrum, if it's really high, that you call the doctor, make sure that you drink water, that you sit down, and that you kind of relax, because stress also sends your sugar up, right? When you're stressed. Make sure you call the doctor if it's really high, because it may be that they need you to come in so they can get you on fluids and get
Yeah.
you, you know, on something to bring it down because it's too high. So
My
both
my
ways.
sec yeah. My second question is if the person is very stressful, is that a cause for diabetes,
Yes.
or
So I
if
just
the
mentioned,
person is obese?
okay, so
So,
obese, and there's two different things here. So let me address one at a time. The first thing is that stress can send your sugar up. The same way that stress will send your blood pressure up, it works very similar for diabetes. In fact, when I was told that I'm a diabetic, I was told that I probably will have blood pressure right behind that, because those two illnesses walk hand in hand. Once you get one, you more than likely will get the other. So when I was diagnosed with diabetes, the next thing they were testing for was my blood pressure. And so, true to what they said, my blood pressure was high as well. So they have to now treat both. They always tell you that you need to lead less stressful lives if you have heart conditions, or so that you don't have heart attacks, or that it doesn't put stress on your heart. And stress is exactly that. It's stress on your heart, it's stress on your body. So when you are stressed out, you are now putting your body into a flight or fight mode, where it needs to fight to maintain, right? And so that puts a stress on your heart, it puts a stress on your blood pressure, it puts a stress on your sugar, it sends all of those things up, right? So stress is something that we need to kind of manage in our lives as well, especially when you have illnesses like diabetes, like heart problems, like any of those issues. You need to manage your stress. Now, in terms of obesity, a lot of people just assume, and this is a myth that I need to address, that people that are that diabetics, all of them are obese. That's not necessarily the case. A lot of diabetics can be obese because of what they're eating. They're eating all the carbs, they're eating all the things that will put weight on, but not every diabetic is obese. You'll have people that are slim, that are thin, that work out, but they're diabetic. Why? Because the insulin that causes them to be diabetic is not being produced by the pancreas, or it's not being produced in the amounts that it needs to be produced to handle what they're eating. So they may be slim. They could be eating, you know, fairly decent food, but they're not producing enough insulin. So that now puts them in the diabetic category diagnosis. That's what
Oh,
diabetes is. Diabetes is your body is not producing enough insulin to break down the food that you're eating so it stays in the blood. It doesn't have anything to do with your obesity. Now, people that eat a lot of carbs may be obese because they're eating too many carbs. That's a whole nother issue, which is why when diabetics do manage their diabetes and manage what they're eating, they lose weight. That's one of the
yeah.
byproducts, right? Because now they're eating better food, they're eating less carbs, they're eating less things that will put the weight on, and they're losing the weight. So it's two things. They're losing the weight, they're getting their sugars under control, and they're more healthy. So it's really not that they're obese that causes diabetes. No, they may be eating the wrong foods, which is why they've got obesity, right? And the insulin is what's causing the diabetes. So that's two different things, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
okay.
Okay.
That makes sense. My last question, that someone told me about it yesterday, that diabetes is reversible. and
Okay.
we can do it through naturopaths. Is that statement correct? I find it difficult to understand that.
Okay, that's a good
Can
question.
any, yeah, any diagnosis can be reversible through naturopath, or can diabetes be controlled by going natural, or going to naturopath and getting some medicine from there?
Okay, so that's a good question. So there's two schools of thought in the medical community, right? There's the medicine, and you get an ailment, you take a pill. There's also the natural and holistic path of
Mm,
school of thought, where you do it naturally. You go boil the tree bark or the bush that your family knows how to make those natural remedies, and then you listen to the body and you go plant-based with your foods, as opposed to eating the chemicals that we eat in the foods that we eat today. For instance, it kind of makes me think about when we were growing up, right? When we were growing up, my family's from the Caribbean. And
mm,
in the Caribbean, they didn't have all these pills that we take today. They
no.
didn't have all of this medicine that we're taking today.
Mm,
They would go out in the backyard or go out to the farm, and they would pick certain bushes and leaves that they knew about, that their grandparents had taught them about. They would boil it, mix it with this, mix it with that, and make a natural remedy to heal from certain things. So they didn't have half of the illnesses that we have. However, the difference is diabetes is big in my community because they eat a lot of carbs. They eat yam, they eat
mm,
potato, they eat rice, beans, they eat a lot of carbs. And so that's part of what's contributed to the diabetic community in my history. But what I'm finding is that I now today, in my journey of dealing with diabetes and dealing with eating well and eating better and eating more green vegetables and plant-based foods, that I'm moving more towards that and moving back to what I grew up on, with natural foods and natural preparation of foods, as opposed to the processed foods that we tend to eat today for convenience. And I
yes.
find that for a lot of people, they will say that they've managed their diabetes. I've talked to people that have been in my life who have managed their diabetes more naturally, with natural foods, with plant-based foods, and it's fared very well for them. Other people are managing it with medication, right?
Mm,
So both can work. It depends on the person and what they feel works best for them. So for me personally, I am moving closer towards natural based foods or plant based foods. So I eat a lot
okay.
of salads, I do a lot of vegetables, so that I can eventually, now some of my medications have been stopped because my sugars are now in normal ranges. So some things have been, my doctor says I don't need them anymore.
Mm,
So yes, I
that's
do
good.
believe
Yeah, that's
I
good. Yeah.
believe that you can actually come off those medications. Some people have come off altogether, 100%. Other people have had them reduced, the dosages reduced. Other people are doing a combination of less medication and more healthy food. Some are combining that with exercise. It depends on what works for you, right? So people, I
Mm,
don't do a whole lot of exercise right now. I have a lot of back issues, but when I was more active, I was walking, I was running, I was doing more activity. And so that I think is also helpful. So activity is helpful for managing diabetes. What you eat is important.
mhm, mhm.
Monitoring your body and what it's going through is important, but also natural methods. If you can do natural methods and more vegetables and more and less meat and more and less processed food, I think that's helpful. Depends on what works for you.
Yeah. There's a saying in my country that the stomach is the household of all illness. If you
Wow.
treat the stomach really nice and clean it properly with good food and everything that is natural, then there's no illness.
Yeah.
So I think that works also for all illnesses, even diabetes. The lifestyle change should have happened,
Yep.
even with myself, with my condition being pre-diabetic.
Yep.
I was just, eating whatever I want. I reduced the sugar,
Uh-huh.
and I'm a bread person. I love bread, every type of bread.
Uh-huh.
and I have to reduce that. So it took me a while, it took me a while to understand why my sugar is fluctuating. So I'm in this journey to understand what's happening to my body. And it was a good meeting with you in this. I met you in another group, and it was a good chance that for me to understand what's diabetes. And thank God that we met, and most of my questions are answered now, for now. So
Uh-huh.
maybe I'll knock your door again, and we can
Oh,
talk again
please.
about different
My
other
door is open.
questions.
Yeah, my door is open. And always, for anybody out there that's listening right now that has a challenge with, as a matter of fact, I probably need to just kind of take a look and see on Facebook if anyone has any questions that have come up while they've been watching. So I'm going to just go to Facebook real quick and just see if there's any questions that people have been asking. I don't see any questions right now, but I'm sure that they will come up at some point. If they have any questions and they're watching this on the replay, that they'll be able to put those questions in the comments, and I can always respond back to those comments. But just in something that you said, the fact that you like bread, there are some great alternatives out there in terms of bread, which have lower carbs, which you can probably substitute for what you've been used to eating. For instance, sourdough bread, as an example, has less carbs than a regular white slice of bread. So sourdough bread, and because the way it's been made with the yeast and how it's been made, has lower carbs than regular bread. And then seeded bread made with seeds also
Yeah,
is an alternative. And there's a lot of seeded bread and more lower carb bread. You just have to find them on the shelves. And they do have a lot of varieties out there that you can choose and substitute for what you've been normally eating, like French bread or white bread or something like
yeah.
that. There's all kinds of alternatives. There's also
I moved
alternatives
I
for
moved from shelf. I moved from the shelf. I
uh-huh.
cook, I make my own bread, because when
Yeah,
you go to the supermarket and you read the labels, they are
yeah,
all additive. They add too many things, and you don't know if it's sugar or if not sugar. So
got you.
what I do now is I make my own bread, but still, where can you find a proper yeast? What type of sugar? All these things are happening. I'm thinking about, and it's a challenge for me because I have to cook for my family, and
Yeah,
most of them are eating bread and rice and all these things, and I need to change all our lifestyle. And it's not helping that there is nothing, like I have to do a lot of research. I have to do a
yeah.
lot of research
But there's a lot of
and
things out there
experiment.
that's available for us. There's a lot of things out there that's available for us. But in terms of even just the bread that you're talking about, you make at home. The reason that my parents used to, at least my stepmother used to make bread at home as well when we were growing up. And we had an oven that they used to break it in next to the coal fire. But the reason that we use sugar in bread is it makes the yeast rise. So there's a lot of breads that they make out there that don't require sugar and don't require a certain kind of yeast. And so then you
Yeah,
don't need the sugar to be in part of the ingredients for that bread making. So there's things out
mm,
there that you can find where you can make your own bread, but you don't necessarily have to put sugar in it because it
yeah,
takes a different kind of yeast to do it. And sugar, it
mm,
makes the yeast rise. And that's why they had to knead the bread, put it in a warm place for it to rise. And the sugar in there helps with that chemical interaction to make the bread rise before you bake it. So there are things out there that you can find, especially if you're making it at home yourself, where you don't
mm,
have to worry about sugar being added. There's different
yeah,
alternatives out
yeah.
there. And there's also
It,
alternatives for the sugar. I like monk fruit, which is a fruit, which is a natural sweetening thing that you can use as a type 2 diabetic in baking and in cooking. Stevia is a natural plant that I like as well. A lot of people don't like stevia. I happen to like stevia. I don't use a lot of it, so I don't have an aftertaste with it. I think a lot of people complain about aftertaste with certain things. Stevia to me
yeah,
doesn't have an aftertaste because I don't use a lot of it. The other thing that I like is allulose, which is also a natural sweetener. And it's the closest thing I found to tasting like sugar that is not sugar and does not spike your sugar. So there's things
mm,
out there. It's just a matter of knowing where to get the information. And hopefully with
yeah,
those questions, if people have questions like that, bring them to the group, and I'll be able to address and help you with those answers and guide you, hopefully. And people in the group who have diabetes, who will be able to also provide those answers for you. So these are the kinds of questions that I'm expecting to see in the group. People not knowing where to go for their sugar alternatives, or how to prepare foods differently than how they've prepared them in the past, now that they're diabetic or have a family member that is. So those are the
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things I'm hoping to have generated in my diabetes type 2 solutions group, so that we can get those answers to those questions, and people can then live and prepare their food and eat their food and enjoy it, and not have to worry about it impacting their sugar.
Yeah, it's very challenging for me, like the recipes and how to change it, because certain things you cannot find it here, and I
Tell us
need
where
to
you
look
are.
for alternate.
Tell
I'm
people where you are.
I'm in Dubai, actually. I'm in the Middle East, and some of the alternative sugar that you told me about doesn't exist here, except for stevia. Stevia leaves aftertaste with me. I'm doing honey, but honey is still sugar, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So I'm doing natural honey, and it's a bit expensive, but still it's
yeah.
still sugar, and I'm looking for alternative for me and my sister. So it's a bit of challenge for me. When I was
I
in
will.
Canada, it was easy. Everything was easy. You know, you
Yeah,
go to the grocery store or the herbal store, and you can find everything. But
yeah,
in the Middle East, they don't. You know, they only recently, the last 5 years, they introduced brown sugar to the market.
yeah.
Before was only white sugar, white bread, white sugar, white everything. So it's a bit of challenge. You know, if you want to do everything by yourself, it's challenging for me anyway. But
They are
it's a
the alternative
lifestyle
you
change,
have.
though.
A lifestyle. It is a lifestyle change. The other challenge that may be a little easier for you, it might be a little bit more costly, but all of these things are available on um,
Online.
yeah, online. You can actually, what is that online? I can't, it's on the tip of my tongue. I'm like, just,
iHerb. I usually deal with iHerb. They have sugar alternative. They bring because only this year they introduced stevia to the market here. So before that, I used to order from iHerb, and they bring it to me,
okay, what
ship it
about
to me.
Amazon? Amazon is a very, very well-known platform too that sells those kinds of things as well. So check Amazon, and it may be a little bit more money because you have to order it from out of the country, but you may have vendors in Dubai that sell on Amazon, where you can get it where it might be cheaper for you in your
Mhm.
country. So check Amazon as well as another alternative. But it's just interesting that we have reached so far across the world to have somebody in Norway, now Dubai, England, where I'm from, different, this social media and the internet and all of that is just so far reaching with who you can reach and how far you can reach, and I just find that so fascinating. It just kind of amazes me
Yeah.
when I find that
It
people are from
brings
all over
people
the world.
together, actually,
It
that have the same
does.
interest,
Yep,
same,
it does.
goals, and it's very interesting. It's very
Yeah,
interesting to
it
me too.
does. It does.
And this is, by
So
the way, this is the first live for me, so I don't know. Maybe I messed up things and stuff like
well,
that, but
no, we don't need to talk about that
you
right
know,
now. We
that's
don't need to do
good.
that. We don't need to do
Anyway,
that.
my anxiety are gone, and that's for me. That's is a huge
Yeah,
plus for
we
me.
don't. So for me,
It's
what I like to say is, I don't like to focus on the negative, because when you focus on the negative, you get more of that. So what I like to
yeah,
say
yeah,
is that we
yeah.
focus on the positive and we get more of the positive. So
Mhm.
that's why I'm trying to cut you off, because I don't want you to go down that. I don't want you to
No,
go
I'm
down that
happy.
road.
I'm happy, Janice, that you allowed me to you actually accepted my suggestion to go and do this live together with these questions. And I'm so happy that I came into your group, because I was so surprised, because I met you in another group, and then I was so jealous of you. You started your own group, and I said, let me talk to her and say, hi. And then this idea came on, and I'm so happy that we're doing the live now.
Yeah,
And most of the questions it was so interesting for me that you answered them, because other people didn't answer specific things for me, and that's important, because someone who went through the stages
yeah,
can tell you the experience, tell you the
yeah,
knowledge, instead of a doctor who never went into these stages,
Yes.
you
I
know,
think you
and the
kind of get
experience.
the
Yeah,
firsthand, you get the firsthand information from somebody who's walked the walk, who's somebody who's
yeah,
experienced it. And so, yes, I think that's important. And I'm so glad that you're part of my community. Anything that you need to understand or questions, please bring them to the group, because if you have the question, what I understand is that other people probably have the same question. But if they're afraid to
yeah,
ask it, you know, somebody being able to ask the question, they can have their question answered as well, because they have the same
yeah.
question, they just didn't have the, you know, the wherewithal to broach the question. So please bring your questions to the group, please, and I will answer the questions in the group so that other people can benefit from that. And before we, are we finished or?
My last question, and I think everyone will relate to this.
Uh-huh.
How can you deal with the shame? Because the person feels shameful that this
When you
happened to
say
them,
shame, it's the
or
same.
when they introduce themselves to a support group or a doctor, I'm diabetic, because I find that in the Middle East they are very shameful about that, to say I am diabetic, or I have epilepsy, or I have this condition. And to me, it's natural. You have to say, because you need, you know, help, you need the medication, you need this, but they keep it to themselves until they go into the hospital.
That's a good
So that
question.
shame, that
That's a
shame
good question.
is how can you deal with that?
That's a good
I
question.
don't
So
know.
let me address that, because I come from the mental health community as well. Before I got into corporate America and before I got into training and consulting, how we perceive certain things, our whatever community we come from, or have we grown up, there's stigmas that are attached to certain
Yes,
things. For instance,
yes,
there's a stigma attached to mental health, and they shouldn't be. Some people have mental issues. It's something we need to you know,
address.
embrace and
Embrace.
address, because we have family members that may be struggling with emotional stuff. And what ends up happening, sometimes if they're depressed and we don't address it, they end up taking their own life. It's something that we need to address. We need
Mm,
to minimize the stigma that is attached to illness, that is attached to mental illness, that is attached to physical illness, because we need to address the issue as opposed to sweeping it under the carpet and acting like it doesn't exist. So
yes,
this is why these platforms like this live, like the groups that we are members of, are important to reach the people that it needs to reach. Because the stigma is, oh, I can't talk about it, or I can't ask the question, or I can't admit that I have this disease because people are going to think something differently about me. That is not even, nobody's going to care about what people think when you get ill, or when
yeah,
something happens and you have to now be forced to address it in the hospital, or, you know, taking care of a major issue that didn't need to happen because you didn't address it. That's
mm,
what matters. Your life
yes,
quality, um, your interaction with your family, your friends, the people that matter to you. What kind of quality of life do you really want? Do you care about what people think? Or do you care about the experience that you're going to have with your family and your life? The quality of your life. What's more important, what people think and what people say, or what you experience with your family and with people that care about you? I always say in some of my training that you've got to care less about the insignificant many and care more about the significant few. The
yes,
people that matter to you,
definitely.
and the people that you care about and that care about you, that's more important than what anybody else out there is going to say, right?
Yeah,
So if
definitely.
they're not going to address it, we as a community need to address it. We as families and friends need to address it. And that's why I formed this platform, because people are walking around with diabetes and don't even know it. And
Know it.
when do they
Yeah.
find out? They find out when
When
it's
the
too late. And that should not be. We shouldn't be dying of diabetes. We shouldn't have our limbs amputated because of diabetes. We shouldn't have, you know, kidneys shut down and be on dialysis because of diabetes. We shouldn't. We need to
we
be
shouldn't.
informed. We need to be informed. And so the stigma of being ashamed, we need to push that behind us, and we need to say, you know what, I'm a diabetic. I need to make some changes. How do I move forward? And so hopefully people like that will find platforms like mine and others where they can talk about their feelings, where they can talk about their struggles, where they can talk about, how do I treat this? How do I go about dealing with this? How do I treat my mind? How do I talk to my mind about this?
Mhm.
We need to dismiss the stigma, definitely.
Oh, also, like a note to conclude this, people will never live your life. You, the
Exactly.
person, will live their own life. So they
Yeah,
have to get or go through the journey by themselves. No one will think or decide for their life.
yeah,
And the choices is that person's choice. The judgment or all these things are insignificant in my mind. Choices are important. People talking are never important.
yeah. So that
So
goes
to
back to my live this morning. My colleague and I were talking about choices, and it's something my father always used to say. You have choices. Jenice, you have choices. And that's so important. We have a choice to make about our own personal lives. So what you just said is profound, and it's very important. And we need to remember that we cannot allow other people to make those choices for us. We need to be able to
yeah,
make those choices for ourselves. And we need to decide, what kind of a quality of life do I want, and make that choice.
I
So
hear
it's
all the
ultimately up to
time,
us.
Janice, in this in the community I'm in, that I am forced to do this. I don't have no choice. I have to do this because people will think or judge me about it. But always, even that action, that type of action, is your choice.
Yeah,
Listening to the people, it's
yeah.
the choice that you take. So if we change a small amount of the way we think, our
Mhm.
life will be changed and
So
to the
different.
better. Yeah,
I believe
so
that.
much
I really
different.
believe that, because I believe the more you think about certain things and the way you speak about certain things is what you manifest. So I believe that's to be true. So that what you said is very important. So I really appreciate the fact that you asked me to come to do this interview with
Interview.
you. And I'm hoping
Thank
that
you
I was
so
able
much.
to
I really
answer your
thank you so much.
questions. What I wanted to do before we end is to go ahead and share my information one more time so that they have it if people need it. I'm
Yes,
going to go ahead and
yes.
share my screen and go ahead and then be able to. Okay, do you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to
If you
do
can
is,
upload also all this as a PDF or just as a post
yeah, I could
in the
probably do
live.
that. Yeah, I could
Yeah.
probably do that. So what I want to do right now is just put it into from the beginning so that you can see the beginning. So then basically my group is Jenisys Solutions. So that's the spelling. It's a take on my name, Jenisys Solutions, type 2 diabetes. And then the contact information, this is some of the contact information that if you're writing it down, that you can have it. I will also upload this to Facebook in the group as well so that you have it if you need it. And then also on the Facebook page, my Facebook feed page. And so Jenisys on Instagram, so Jenice.Walters on Instagram, Jenisys Alternative Recipes, if you're looking to get some ideas on different things to prepare, salads, smoothies, brunch items, sugar-free desserts, then you can check out Jenisys Alternative Recipes, type 2 diabetic. And then also to get access to the group, the diabetes group, it's Jenisys Solutions type 2 diabetes on Facebook, and you can also get in touch with us there to forward your questions. And then this is some additional information in terms of the upcoming podcast that is happening in January of 2021. Jenisys Speaks Diabetes Type 2. And then just to remind you of the live interview events on Mondays that will be streamed to Facebook Live um, from, from Zoom. We will stream that to Facebook. And then of course, also the live 8:30 Central Time Monday musings with myself and Lois Garner from As We Go. And that happens at 8:30 on Monday Central Time, 9:30 Eastern Time, and the live events that we had like today with Mona, 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time on Mondays, and then 12 o'clock noon Eastern time. So that's the information. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And thank you once again for having me here on this interview with you. I appreciate it. And again, thank you for being part of the community.
Thank you so much for accepting my invitation to this live and to answering all my questions. I might have on the long run some other questions. It's very, really interesting for me to understand that this disease, because yesterday I just, I did a test for my daughter, and she's only 16 and she's pre-diabetic. So I have to, put this whole thing into a plan, lifestyle change, and focus on it. So I need a lot of research.
So here's the thing. So I will actually be interviewing you at some point where we can talk about those things, because this is a whole different podcast now that we're talking about. So I think that we can definitely put you on the schedule so that we can talk about those things that you're going through with your family, and we can talk about how you're handling it. That's going to be a very, very interesting live in coming in the coming year, because I do have people scheduled until the end of January. So I think sometime in February, we will get you back here live so that we can then talk about how you're faring or how you're doing.
I'll be traveling in Feb. So
well, we can talk about it offline. We can talk about we can talk about that offline.
No problem.
Yeah, we can talk about that offline.
I enjoyed our talk. Thank you so much, Janice.
Thank you for
I was really happy that I met you. It's very interesting for me how we met, and thank you so much for allowing me to do this interview with you, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
No problem. We're going to have you back again live. So thank you for being part of the community, and thank you, Facebook, for listening and for being here and sharing this information with us. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.